Hi, I'm Kristen Goodwin. On this episode of the Fox News Rundown, the Senate Judiciary Committee will act this week to subpoena the CEOs of Twitter and Facebook to testify about their site's restrictions on a controversial New York Post article Republicans say is damaging to Democrats. Host of Media Buzz, Howard Kurtz, weighs in on the criticism surrounding social media sites, limiting the reach of the report, and the final days of a highly contentious presidential race. As Americans focus on November 3rd, there's been plenty of speculation and questions about polling. Who is winning where and which polls to trust? Daron Shaw, a member of the Fox News Decision Desk and co-director of the Fox News poll, discusses the science of polling and what pollsters are doing differently this election season. Plus commentary from Fox News contributor Kat Timpf. The Fox News Rundown is a daily news podcast where we take a deeper look at the stories important to you. You can subscribe on your favorite podcast player by going to foxnewspodcast.com.
I'm Maria Bartiromo.
I'm Greg Gutfeld.
I'm Tammy Bruce, and this is the Fox News Rundown.
Wednesday, October 21st, 2020. I'm Dave Anthony. How Facebook and Twitter covered, or Republicans say covered up, a controversial Hunter Biden report has social media under more scrutiny.
These actions by these two Silicon Valley companies actually end up drawing far more attention to the New York Post Hunter Biden story than would have been the case otherwise. So it accomplished the exact opposite of what they intended.
I'm Jessica Rosenthal. The polls are tightening, and while most pollsters still say the numbers give an edge to Joe Biden,
right now, a couple weeks out, there are definitely pathways for Trump to win, and people who don't say that are setting themselves up to look like fools again 4 years from now.
And I'm Kat Timpf. I've got the final word on the Fox News Rundown.
It's made Republicans even more anti-social media. The way people were blocked from sharing a controversial story online about Joe Biden's son, Hunter. Senator Ted Cruz wants to question the CEOs of Facebook and Twitter at a hearing.
And we need answers before the election because this is dangerous. It is a real threat to free speech.
Now, the New York Post broke the story that a laptop purportedly belonging to Hunter Biden was said to be abandoned at a Delaware computer repair shop. Emails were found between Biden and a Ukrainian business leader wanting his help dealing with an investigation and then thanking Biden for setting up a meeting with his then vice president father, though the Biden campaign says there's no official record of any such meeting. But President Trump told Fox and Friends he wants Attorney General Bill Barr to investigate.
And he's got to act fast. He's got to appoint somebody. This is major corruption, and this has to be known about before the election.
The New York Post's op-ed editor, Sohrab Ahmari, also told Fox on Tuesday,
this is solidly, deeply reported material and more corroborated than any number of anti-Trump stories that appeared over the past 4 years.
But others in the media are skeptical. There are even some at the Post questioning the credibility of the Biden story, including one of its writers who reportedly didn't want his name on it. Many Democrats also dismissed the reporting because the repair shop owner is a Republican who supposedly gave the emails and other info to Trump lawyer Rudy Giuliani. House Intelligence Committee Chairman Adam Schiff told CNN it looks like Russian meddling to him.
Clearly, the origins of this whole smear are from the Kremlin.
Now, the director of national intelligence, John Ratcliffe, told Fox,
with regard to Hunter Biden's laptop being part of a Russian disinformation campaign and the intelligence community believing that or assessing that is simply not true.
Back to social media. Democratic Senator Chris Coons says those companies were following sound policies
to not spread things that are utterly unreliable, that have been debunked, and where their origin is untrustworthy.
What does our media critic think?
What was a bit shocking, an even bigger surprise than the, quote, October surprise itself, is the way that Twitter and Facebook engaged in outright censorship to try to suppress this story.
Howie Kurtz hosts Media Buzz on the Fox News channel and has a Media Buzz Meter podcast.
There are a lot of questions that can be raised about the New York Post handling of this. Have the emails from Hunter Biden been confirmed? How is it that Rudy Giuliani got involved? Did the laptops really go into a blind computer owner shop in Delaware? I mean, you can't make this stuff up. But nevertheless, this was a story published by one of America's largest newspapers, and Twitter in particular just completely engaged in censorship. Couldn't share it, couldn't send it to anybody else in direct message, then realized what a colossal blunder this was, backed off in about 2 days, and finally lifted the ban. This after locking the Trump campaign's account. So I think this gave absolute ammunition to President Trump, conservatives, and anybody who's been critical of these social media giants for putting their collective thumb on the digital scale.
Now, the idea behind the ban or not letting people share it was that this could have been hacked material, correct?
That was the rationale that Twitter gave. Facebook took a different route and limited the distribution while having an outside fact-checker look into it. I don't know. It's been several days. Whatever happened to this outside fact-checker idea? I think it was a kind of a fig leaf. In the case of Twitter, it said hack material is really bad. And then 2 days later it said, well, hack material is okay. You can share it as long as you're not the hacker. The point is, it backfired not just in terms of the fact that there's going to be a Capitol Hill hearing and the CEOs of these companies are going to get beaten up, but these actions by these two Silicon Valley companies actually end up drawing far more attention to the New York Post Hunter Biden story than would have been the case otherwise. So it accomplished the exact opposite of what they intended.
Do you think it's a tough job, though, for social media because people use it for all sorts of reasons, including for the spreading of misinformation if they want? I mean, it's a platform that allows them to do that if they can. So it's not easy for Twitter and for Facebook, is it?
You know what? It's time for them to grow up. They face the same challenges that every news organization faces. What happens when you get an ad with unproven claims? What happens when you have a source who has sensational allegations that perhaps there is only fragmentary evidence of? What do you do about sources that have agendas? Every local television station, national network, newspaper, magazine deals with this. Facebook and Twitter have made a huge amount of money and used to be incredibly popular. I mean, they're still popular in terms of users, but in terms of their reputation, by pretending, we're just like the electric company. Like, people post whatever they want. We don't have anything to say about it. It's not our fault. We have legal immunity. Well, they've slowly been coming to grips with, we won't allow hate speech. Well, we won't allow bullying. Well, we won't allow disinformation. And now in the final weeks of a heated campaign, they're realizing how hard it is to make these decisions. I agree with the premise of your question, but they should have dealt with this long ago rather than pretend that they're not media companies. They are, in fact, the most influential media companies in history.
Let's go to the fact-checking part. I mean, that's a big thing in the last several years. Fact-checkers, everybody's got a fact-checker who goes through all the information. But how easy is it to actually fact-check stories that come out at being researched by the Post in this case, or something the New York Times did with anonymous sources? How do you fact-check those?
Sometimes with great difficulty, and major organizations like the New York Times and the Washington Post and others have attempted and failed, they say, to authenticate that these are actually Hunter Biden's emails. Now, I think they probably are, only because the Biden campaign hasn't specifically denied the authenticity of these emails. But at the same time, the fact-checking part of it is it's hard to prove a negative. Unless a source turns or a document turns out to be a forgery, when somebody makes a claim, it can be difficult to say, well, that story is absolutely untrue. And because the media is so widely distrusted these days, and thanks in no small part to President Trump's constant attacks, many people now do not trust the fact-checkers.
What if the information in this Hunter Biden story did come from Ukraine or did come from Russia? What if it really was hacked information, but the emails and the material is actually real? Then what?
Well, that would raise the same questions that were raised in 2016 when the fact that WikiLeaks was involved in hacking Democratic National Committee and emails and Hillary Clinton emails and so forth. People said, tut-tut, that's really unfortunate, and now here's the story, and everybody would go wild over the story. But I would just raise a larger point, and that is, look, I don't think we need that much more evidence that Hunter Biden, who was a drug addict, was engaged in very unseemly profiteering off of his father's high position. Now, it still hasn't been proven that Joe Biden did anything wrong. Now, this meeting that may or may not have taken place with a guy from the Ukrainian energy company Burisma, if Biden was found to have not told the truth about that, well, that would certainly go to the heart of his credibility, and that would be important. But by and large, I think these emails confirm and perhaps amplify what we already knew, which was that Joe Biden had a son, and maybe he looked the other way, who was trying to make a lot of money in places where he had no qualifications or expertise because his dad was vice president.
The media itself hasn't really wanted to cover this story. At least there have been not nearly as much coverage in other networks. Fox has covered it a lot more than MSNBC or CNN. And the CNN and the MSNBC coverage, has it been just more or less trying to debunk it?
Well, for the first 24 hours after the story broke, there was virtually no coverage on CNN or MSNBC. They attempted to ignore their stories. I thought it was a real failing that in an hour and a half of airtime during that ABC town hall with Joe Biden, George Stephanopoulos didn't bring up a single question about Hunter Biden, if only to give the former vice president a chance to say whatever he wanted to say. Now, I don't think everybody's ignoring it. For example, we don't get many chances to question Biden. He doesn't allow much press access. But when he was coming in or out of an event, a CBS reporter asked him a very simple question. He said, "Do you have any comment on the New York Post story on Hunter Biden?" And the former VP snapped at him, said it's a smear. The story was a smear. It's his right to say. And then went after the reporter, saying, I'm not surprised that you would ask that question. That's the kind of question that you would ask. Well, it's a legitimate question. And I do think you can make a case that so much of the mainstream media is so heavily invested in hostility toward President Trump, and at this point, for many of them, not all, but for many of them, I would say his defeat, that they are going easy on these questions raised by Biden. I don't think that the election is going to turn on Hunter Biden by any means. I think the pandemic, the economy, and other close-to-home issues will ultimately decide this election. But we should make some attempt to hold both candidates to a similar standard.
Howie just mentioned that Joe Biden town hall. It was on at the same time last Thursday as the NBC News town hall featuring President Trump, who said at a rally in Arizona on Monday,
"So I had Savannah Guthrie the other night. She was like a crazed lunatic. She was literally rising out of her chair as she's screaming questions."
He complains Joe Biden gets treated differently.
Well, I was pretty critical myself. I mean, having to watch both of those simultaneously, which is not something I recommend you try at home. It's kind of difficult.
It was tough. I tried flipping back and forth. It wasn't easy.
Yeah. Look, Savannah Guthrie came out like a boxer with her fists up. First 20 minutes, she ignored the town hall audience and just pummeled the president on his personal handling of COVID-19, on white supremacists, on QAnon. At one point, she likened him to a crazy uncle. I think she was under a lot of pressure because a lot of people at NBC and especially MSNBC didn't think that town hall should have been held at all. Stephanopoulos has his own style, but I think he was a little bit tougher when he did his own ABC town hall with President Trump. Certainly the president seems to think so. And he asked Joe Biden a lot of good questions, but they were policy questions. He didn't follow up much, except on the question of court packing, where Biden continued to be evasive. And he deferred much more to the audience. They were, after all, town halls. But he never questioned Biden's record, character, credibility. It was more like, well, tell us what you plan you would have on this, that, or the other thing. And so the contrast between those two events happening simultaneously in place of the second canceled debate was so stark, was so night and day, that I think it reinforced people's view that the president always gets aggressive, bordering on prosecutorial questioning, and Joe Biden not so much.
Was the media more curious about the Steele dossier and all of the stuff with Donald Trump and President Trump as he won the election and got into his first year? A lot of that stuff was never verified either, correct?
Well, I'm not in the camp that says that because the Steele dossier was unverified and, and the people surrounding it had agendas, that therefore everything that followed is completely illegitimate. I mean, that's what the president says. The Russia investigation was a hoax. I mean, keep in mind, it was the president's own deputy attorney general who appointed Robert Mueller, who conducted this investigation. A bunch of people got indicted. Some went to jail or pleaded guilty. There were questions raised about some of the president's conduct. Nevertheless, ultimately, he was right. There was no collusion with Russia that could be proven on his part or anybody close to him. But I don't fall into the camp that says, therefore, because there were problems with that shaky Steele dossier, which I always was skeptical of, and everybody should have been skeptical of, that every single thing that followed from that was not legitimate journalism.
Howie Kurtz, host of Media Buzz on the Fox News channel, also the Media Buzz Meter podcast. Thanks very much for joining us again.
Thanks. Very good to talk to you.
This is Kat Timpf with your Fox News commentary. Coming up.
Do you believe? Some of us see a poll and think, okay, that means something. Others, it seems increasingly, say, no, it does not. And sometimes the poll matters only if we want it to. This was President Trump in late July.
We're leading in Arizona. We're leading nicely in Florida. I think our poll numbers are very good. We're leading substantially in Georgia. I mean, we get a lot of suppression polls. We get a lot of fake polls, just like we have fake news. I mean, it's a terrible thing.
The president and his supporters have said this many times. The polls are wrong, referring to polls not internal to the campaign. But earlier this month, the president liked the results of one survey.
A Gallup poll just came out that found that 56% of Americans say they're better off today than they were under Sleepy Joe and Obama. It's the highest of any president at this point in his term. Let's think of that, 56%.
Many think back 4 years ago and think the polls were wrong. Were they? We're going to get into it. But first, what generally do the presidential election day polls indicate right now?
Joe Biden and the Democrats generally, but Joe Biden in particular, with something on the order of 6 to 8 point lead in the national polls.
Daron Shaw is a professor at the University of Austin, Texas, and a member of the Fox News decision team.
Tighter in the battleground states, and then generally engaged, kind of energized electorate, which I think has been underrated a little bit throughout this year and is coming into focus as we look at some of the early voting numbers now. So that's sort of one bucket, which is it seems to be, slightly Democratic. The other bucket, observation from polling land, is the unbelievable anxiety and trepidation that pollsters have as they put these numbers out there. The scars of 2016, which you alluded to, are fresh. In my opinion, they're healthy. Pollsters ought to be very attentive to the sorts of issues that are, I think, always out there with polls, but came into, just very sharp relief in 2016. So we are absolutely paranoid about response rates, about the possibility of asymmetries in who wants to answer a poll and who doesn't, and who feels social desirability, not reveal a preference, and all that kind of stuff. They are very much on everybody's mind.
People love saying, though, that 4 years ago the polls were wrong, right? Like to this day, the polls were so wrong 4 years ago. How wrong were they if they were wrong? Because I know the other line of thought is, well, wait a second. National polling did show Hillary Clinton ahead, and that was in fact the case, right? I mean, she won the popular vote. But then you drill down on like battleground states, and I read, some pollsters got some of those swing states right, but Wisconsin was maybe a fail. When you look back on 2016 and you hear people say, whoa, they were so wrong, what's your response?
I think you just told the story. The national polls were pretty good. And then the statewide polls, it's a mixed bag. But as a pollster, I mean, the one thing that I think is a little crazy is for pollsters to sit back after 2016 and go, oh, well, we did everything right. We can't help it if the public's too dumb to understand. No. Pollsters clearly left voters and journalists and all interested observers with the impression that there was very little chance for Trump to win. And so I think there weren't enough polls in the key states. That was one factor. And then the accuracy of those polls was a little funky. And like Pennsylvania is an interesting story because in Pennsylvania, there were a decent number of polls and they had the race pretty close. I think we overinterpreted or misinterpreted. In other words, we fell in love with the consistency of the small Clinton lead, ignoring that it was a very small Clinton lead. And things I do think changed in the last 10 days. In a state like Wisconsin, there just wasn't enough high quality polling. So I'm not sure how bad it was. That's not to let pollsters off the hook. It's just to say I think there's a mixed bag depending upon what state we're talking about. This time around, what's interesting is states that may not have gotten much attention in previous years are getting a ton of polling. So not only are you seeing literally dozens and dozens of polls in the upper Midwest states, you're seeing a fair amount of high-quality professional polling in Georgia and Texas. Some of these places, well, maybe they're battlegrounds, maybe they're not. That makes me feel a little better about having a wide range of smart people looking at these races and bringing data to the table. But I think the main thing that you suggested is totally right, which is, we got to have the courage of our own convictions. If I tell you, I think Biden's 60% likely to win, and Trump's 40%, that 40% is a big deal. And right now, a couple weeks out, there are definitely pathways for Trump to win. And people who don't say that are setting themselves up to look like fools again 4 years from now.
Yeah, and the president and his supporters, they do consistently downplay the polls, and they do sometimes get technical, right? Some of his surrogates have said, look, there is just a massive oversampling of Democratic voters. What's your response to that kind of criticism?
In the particular case of party, we've been really consistent throughout the years that, like I mentioned, the gender balance of the electorate, the age structure of the electorate, the race and regional structures of the electorate. These things are pretty fixed and pretty well known. The party distribution on election day in 2020 is unknown. We do not know the proportion of Republicans and Democrats that are going to show up to vote. Historically, the range has been from roughly even to about +8 Democratic. The Democrats, in terms of raw identification, are the majority party in the United States. They really have been since Franklin Roosevelt. Ebbed and flowed over time. Republicans kind of get to even occasionally. And I think people conflate that. Look, because Republicans tend to defect at lower rates, Republicans can win facing a party identification disadvantage. That was obviously true in the Reagan years. I mean, Reagan destroyed Walter Mondale. Yeah, even though, the party identification structure was still slightly favorable to the Democrats. So party and the vote are not the same thing. Party is an attitude. It's not a demographic characteristic. And we won't, at Fox and at the University of Texas and other places that do polls, we don't weight by party identification because it's an attitude. And once you structure the sample such that it's got the correct demographics, then party identification is going to shift a little bit as you get those other features right. And then it is what it is. Now, I would say this, one caveat. In the statewide polls, we're drawing from lists of registered voters. We know what the party distribution is from the sample we drew, and we know what the party distribution is from our respondents. And so we can actually look at, in Pennsylvania, the list says it should be 47% Democratic, 42% Republican. And if we come out and in the party structure in the actual sample, we see that the actual respondent structure is skewed one way or the other, that's an important piece of information, and we will act on it, right? We'll weight not to party, but we'll weight other characteristics to make sure that that we're accounting for response bias potentials and asymmetries in partisans' willingness to respond.
There are a couple of pollsters who do seem to defy the others, for lack of a better word. For example, the Trafalgar poll, right? And you look at the Real Clear Politics averages for each swing state, you can see even right now, Trafalgar's often the only poll giving Trump the edge over Biden in some states, not all, not Pennsylvania, for example, this time around. This is the same pollster that had Trump winning some key swing states 4 years ago, namely Michigan and Florida, right?
That's right. I think it's nice when those pollsters get a lot of attention and do long or longish interviews where they talk about their methodology, they talk about their approach and philosophy, because you want to learn. We're constantly asking ourselves if we're missing something, if our assumptions are correct. And I think, so I like listening to different people who've had success or use different approaches. The specific claims that I've read from Trafalgar are pretty interesting. It seems to me that there's sort of a mixed methodology. That is, they're doing kind of traditional phones, but they're also doing online, and they're doing some smartphones, and they're doing a mix of probability and non-probability polling, which I'm always a little hesitant about, because non-probability sampling is got much higher degree of uncertainty than probability sampling. But then there's sort of the general philosophical.
Really briefly?
Non-probability sampling runs the gamut. It's essentially, rather than randomly sampling from a known population, you are essentially taking people who are not randomly selected. So sometimes that means that they self-select. Sometimes it means that your intention is getting a random sample, but from a particular part of the population. And the problem is that when polls that do that offer a margin of error, that's actually technically inappropriate. There is no margin of error associated with a non-probability sample. Margin of error is absolutely the assumption that you are adhering to probability statistics.
But back to Trafalgar, you were saying also that you like learning from pollsters like this, despite the non-probability aspect.
Oh yeah, and he had some points about the presence of white, less well-educated voters in the last election cycle, and most of Trafalgar's stuff is obviously being done in the state level, and so he's very observant to the characteristics from the voter files. When you read that, in some ways it's reassuring because we're doing, we're paying attention to the same sorts of things. The polls that I've been doing are actually closer to the average as opposed to the Trafalgar stuff. And so, yeah, it's just kind of a different mix, but everybody's got the same hymnal, even if we're not on the same page.
Okay. So Daron, final thought. At this stage, 2 weeks out, with millions of us having already voted, and the people maybe hanging onto those ballots last minute or planning to go day of, being sort of the deciders, maybe. What are your predictions based on what you're seeing now?
I think Biden has a slight edge, but my goodness, after 2016, and I do think it's important to recall that in the statewide polls, I think you're really in a situation right now where the president needs to flip about 5 or 6 states, right? He needs to lock down Ohio to win Florida, Carolina, Arizona, Pennsylvania, and I might be missing one. And so on the one hand, you think like, well, he's got a lot of ground to make up in the national polls. He doesn't need to. He needs to basically kind of shift things 3 to 5 points in a very small handful of states. So is there a path? There's absolutely a path. And if the polls are off by a couple of points, then that path is even more tractable because it's not 3 to 5 points. Let's say he only needs to move it 1 to 3. And I think that's important to remember. So, slight Biden lead, but my goodness, 2.5 weeks, that's a lot of time. Remember when we thought impeachment was going to be a big issue? So that's an eternity in 2020, as we all know.
Wow, good point. Daron Shaw, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
From the Fox News Podcasts Network. Subscribe and listen to the Trey Gowdy Podcast. Former federal prosecutor and 4-term U.S. Congressman from South Carolina brings you a one-of-a-kind podcast. Subscribe and listen now by going to foxnewspodcasts.com.
It's time for your Fox News commentary.
Kat Timpf.
What's on your mind?
Few stories have captivated my attention quite like the controversy over Ice Cube deciding to help President Trump craft a plan that would aim to create jobs for millions of Black Americans. Part of the reason I'm sure is that I happen to be a lifelong Ice Cube fan. Once Upon a Time in the Projects has been one of my favorite songs since childhood. Wow, I've really never been anything but a libertarian, have I? But the bigger one is that this seems to be one of those news stories where pretty much everyone is missing the point. The people on the left who are furious that Ice Cube is working with Trump are getting it wrong. The people on the right who are elated that Ice Cube is working with Trump are getting it wrong. And the people who say that controversy proves that people get far too angry at others for refusing to color inside partisan lines are also getting it wrong. What it proves is much worse than that. As a culture, we're now largely so hyper-partisan that far too many of us can't even understand the concept of someone wanting to focus on policy and solutions over partisanship. Now, I'm not going to weigh in on his policy proposal itself. What's more, seeing as I'm a white person, I obviously don't have any barometer for how this sort of thing could uniquely impact someone who is Black. I can't relate to any of that. But one thing that I can relate to as someone who has never aligned herself with either major political party is this increasingly weird phenomenon that it's not just unacceptable, but actually impossible to exist anywhere but firmly inside of one camp or the other. That you're either with us or you're with them, that any and all discussions must be viewed through this prism. See, what Ice Cube is doing here is in fact so clear that I don't even have to have achieved my lifelong dream of actually knowing him to be able to see it. He's choosing policy over partisan politics. This is blatantly obvious, not only because of the fact that recently he said he's offered his advice on this to both campaigns, but also because that's what he's been saying. At the beginning of last month, he tweeted that he was talking to both sides about his contract with Black America Initiative, calling it a totally bipartisan issue that the country wants to solve. Ice Cube cares about this issue, and he's simply pursuing all avenues in order to make his vision a reality. People can't comprehend this. It's been so strange yet familiar to see how people have been accusing Ice Cube of being a hypocrite and using past statements he's made about how much he doesn't like Trump as evidence of their position. It's honestly crazy to me that people would see him as not being a fan of President Trump and him being willing to try and do whatever it takes, regardless of those personal feelings, to make the country a better place as being mutually exclusive. They're not mutually exclusive. To say that they are is indisputably wrong, and I have zero idea why that seems to be so difficult to understand. I have long said that we need to get to a place where we can focus on finding solutions to problems over finding ways that the other side is worse. At this point, I guess I may have to put that kind of talk on the back burner. Not because I don't want to see that become reality, because it's still my ultimate goal, because apparently we have to work on even being able to recognize that such a thing is possible, even when we see it happen right in front of our faces. I'm Kat Timpf.
You've been listening to the Fox News Rundown. Stay up to date by subscribing to this podcast at foxnewspodcasts.com. And for up-to-the-minute news, go to foxnews.com. Getting Schooled is a podcast hosted by Fox Nation's Abby Hornacek. Each week, Abby and her expert guests tackle topics we take for granted and help explain the roots and meanings behind them. Subscribe and listen now by going to foxnewspodcasts.com. America is listening to Fox News.
Love Fox News? Click the subscribe button to get more of the news and opinion you trust. And click the Fox News Rundown playlist for the latest episodes.